Kendrick Robinson, a seasoned federal prosecutor, pulled into the parking lot outside the Greenville Municipal Courthouse in South Carolina at exactly 8:50 a.m. The warm morning sunlight cast long shadows across the asphalt as Kendrick took a deep breath. He hated being late. As someone whose professional life revolved around discipline and preparedness, tardiness was not something he took lightly. But today life had conspired against him. What should have been a straightforward morning had turned into something far more complicated. His only task was to challenge an error in a property tax adjustment on the house his grandmother had left him. The city had inexplicably raised the taxes, and Kendrick had spent weeks gathering evidence to prove it was a mistake. But to Kendrick, the house was more than just a piece of property. It was the anchor of his childhood, the place where he had learned right from wrong under the watchful eye of his grandmother. That morning, Kendrick had carefully reviewed his documents and was fully prepared to present his case before the judge. However, an urgent phone call had disrupted his routine. A federal human trafficking case required his immediate attention. The defense team had filed a last-minute motion, and Kendrick had no choice but to review it and provide feedback to his team. By the time he was done, he realized he was cutting it dangerously close to his court appointment. As he hurried toward the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed again. A quick glance revealed a message from his assistant at the U.S. Attorney's office. "The judge in Greenville has a reputation for being tough on latecomers. Be careful." Kendrick sighed and tucked his phone into his briefcase. He wasn't overly worried. Facts were his greatest weapon, and today, he came armed with undeniable evidence. Still, something about that message lingered in his mind. He shook it off as he entered the cool interior of the courthouse. The Greenville Municipal Courthouse was nothing like the federal courts where Kendrick spent most of his days. The walls were a dull beige, the seats scuffed from decades of use, and the air carried the faint scent of old paper and stale coffee. Despite its worn appearance, the place buzzed with activity. People shuffled in and out, clutching stacks of documents, their faces etched with anxiety over parking tickets, minor disputes, and small claims. Kendrick checked his watch. 8:50 a.m. 10 minutes to spare. Barely enough time to locate the correct courtroom. He followed the signs down a narrow hallway, passing by murmuring individuals and hushed conversations, until he finally reached room 204. Judge Charles Whitman. The name was etched in brass on the door, reflecting the dim hallway light. Kendrick adjusted his tie, took a steadying breath, and stepped inside. The courtroom was already filling with people, each with their own anxieties and concerns. Kendrick found a seat near the back, flipped open his folder, and began reviewing his evidence one last time. As he scanned his notes, he caught a glimpse of Judge Whitman entering the room. A tall man with a silver mane and piercing blue eyes, Judge Whitman commanded attention without uttering a word. His reputation for being a no-nonsense figure was evident in the way he surveyed the courtroom, his sharp gaze missing nothing. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the room shuffled to its feet. Kendrick joined in, his posture straight as the judge settled into his chair. But what happened next was unexpected. Although Kendrick had arrived with minutes to spare, Judge Whitman reprimanded him for being late, imposing an excessive $750 fine. Kendrick maintained his composure, offering a calm and respectful explanation about the urgent federal case that had delayed him. However, the judge was unmoved. "Excuses don't excuse tardiness," he had said curtly, dismissing Kendrick's explanation with a wave of his hand. What struck Kendrick even more was the stark contrast in how other latecomers were treated. He had watched as a middle-aged man in a suit slipped in unnoticed, followed by a young woman in casual clothes who received no reprimand. Neither of them was called out, let alone fined. Kendrick couldn't ignore the disparity. As he sat quietly in the back, he took mental notes, his legal instincts kicking in. This was more than just a matter of tardiness. It was a pattern, one that Kendrick could recognize as plainly as the documents in his briefcase. The morning had started with a simple goal: to challenge a property tax adjustment. But as Kendrick sat there, observing the blatant inequity unfolding before him, he realized that this was about something much bigger. This was not just about his case. It was about justice, fairness, and a system that seemed blind to its own biases. Kendrick knew in that moment that this morning would mark the beginning of something much larger than he had anticipated. As Kendrick Robinson stood at the podium in courtroom 204, he felt the weight of dozens of eyes fixed on him. His name had just been called, but before he could present his case, Judge Charles Whitman's piercing gaze hardened, signaling that something was amiss. "You're late, Mr. Robinson." The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom, sharp and authoritative. Do you think the court's time is less valuable than your own? Kendrick, ever composed, raised his hand slightly in acknowledgement, his demeanor calm and respectful. Your Honor, he began, I apologize for the delay. I was attending to urgent federal matters that required immediate attention. But Judge Whitman was not interested in explanations. Excuses don't excuse tardiness, he declared, cutting Kendrick off mid-sentence. This court operates on order and respect. If you can't follow that, perhaps you should reevaluate your priorities. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with murmurs of discomfort and curiosity from those seated in the gallery. Kendrick, maintaining his composure, attempted to redirect the focus to the matter at hand. Your Honor, he continued, I understand the importance of timeliness. If I may, I'd like to present my case regarding the property tax adjustment. But the judge's mind was already made up. We'll get to that, he said dismissively, his tone cold. First, there's the matter of contempt. Tardiness undermines the integrity of these proceedings. You are hereby fined $750. The words hit Kendrick like a blow, but he kept his expression neutral. The fine was excessive, punitive even, for such a minor delay. But what disturbed Kendrick more than the fine was the blatant disparity unfolding before him. Earlier that morning, Kendrick had watched a middle-aged man in a suit slip into the courtroom a few minutes late, unnoticed by the judge. Moments later, a young woman in casual clothes had done the same, finding a seat near the front without drawing any attention. Neither had been reprimanded, let alone fined. Yet Kendrick, a seasoned federal prosecutor with an impeccable track record, was being publicly penalized for arriving just minutes before the scheduled hearing. As he returned to his seat, Kendrick's mind was already piecing together the events that had transpired. This isn't about being late, he thought, his instincts honed by years in the legal system. This is something deeper. Kendrick's sharp eye for detail quickly picked up on the inconsistencies. The fine itself was disproportionate, but the real concern was the inconsistency in how cases were being handled. He scanned the room, noting the expressions of those around him, a mix of disbelief, discomfort, and curiosity. Even those who had been present long enough to witness the disparity were visibly unsettled. Kendrick could feel it, the unspoken acknowledgement that something was wrong. His legal instincts kicked in, and he began mentally cataloging every detail. The names, the faces, the sequence of events, and most importantly, the judge's selective application of discipline. As Kendrick sat back down, he opened his folder, but his focus had shifted. He was no longer thinking about the property tax documents in front of him. His pen moved swiftly across the page, jotting down observations that had nothing to do with tax adjustments. He recorded the judge's tone, the treatment of the other latecomers, and the subtle but undeniable disparities that had unfolded in plain sight. This was no longer about a tax dispute. Kendrick was witnessing a pattern, one that he had seen before, a pattern of bias cloaked in authority, affecting people of color disproportionately within the justice system. And today, that bias had been directed at him. Kendrick had spent his career fighting for justice, often in high-stakes cases involving human trafficking, corruption, and civil rights violations. But what he had witnessed today was something far more insidious, the kind of everyday injustice that went unnoticed by most but was all too familiar to those who experienced it. As he glanced around the room, he noticed a young law student in the corner, her pen moving furiously across her notebook as she documented the moment. An older black man sitting 2 rows ahead turned slightly, offering Kendrick a brief but knowing glance, a silent acknowledgement that spoke volumes. Even the court clerk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, hesitated just long enough for Kendrick to notice her unease. When Kendrick's name was called again at 9:15 a.m., he stood with the same calm confidence that had defined his career. His stride was measured, deliberate, as he approached the podium once more. Judge Whitman's eyes followed him, his expression unchanged, but Kendrick was undeterred. Your Honor, he began, his voice steady and composed. I have here documentation regarding the erroneous property tax adjustment. The property has been in my family for decades, and these adjustments do not align with the city's assessed values. He presented his evidence with the same meticulous preparation that had earned him a reputation as one of the most respected prosecutors in his district. But even as he spoke, Kendrick's mind was still processing the larger issue at hand. He knew this hearing was just the beginning. When the hearing concluded and Kendrick stepped outside into the cool morning air, the tension still clung to him. He paused at the courthouse steps, his thoughts racing. His thumb hovered over his phone, ready to call his assistant at the U.S. Attorney's office, but he stopped himself. "Not yet," he murmured. There was more work to be done, more evidence to gather, and more patterns to uncover. This was not just about his own experience. It was about ensuring that what had happened today would not happen to others. Kendrick Robinson had come to court that morning to settle a tax dispute. But as he walked away from the courthouse, he knew he was leaving with something far greater. The seeds of a much larger battle for justice that was only just beginning. As Kendrick Robinson left the Greenville Municipal Courthouse that morning, the cool air did little to soothe the turmoil simmering within him. His mind was no longer preoccupied with the property tax adjustment that had initially brought him to court. Instead, he was consumed by a deeper, more urgent concern: the blatant disparity he had just witnessed. The $750 fine imposed on him for a minor delay was not just excessive. It was emblematic of a larger, more insidious problem. While others who had arrived late were allowed to slip into the courtroom unnoticed, Kendrick, a black federal prosecutor with an impeccable record, had been singled out and penalized. And this, Kendrick knew, was not an isolated incident. It was a pattern, one that had been quietly perpetuated for years in courtrooms across the country. As Kendrick sat in his car, his briefcase resting on the passenger seat, he took a moment to reflect. His mind replayed the events of the morning, each detail etched into his memory. The indifferent treatment of the middle-aged man in the suit, the young woman in casual clothes who had slipped in without consequence, the cold reprimand and disproportionate fine directed solely at him. "This isn't just about me," Kendrick thought, his jaw tightening. "This is about something much bigger." Kendrick opened his briefcase and pulled out his badge and credentials, the gold emblem of the United States Department of Justice glinting in the sunlight streaming through the windshield. He had spent over a decade fighting for justice, prosecuting cases of human trafficking, corruption, and civil rights violations. Yet here he was, confronted by an injustice happening not in some distant courtroom, but right in front of him. "If I let this go," he murmured softly, "it'll keep happening." Kendrick was no stranger to systemic bias. He had seen it unfold in countless cases, but experiencing it firsthand in such a blatant manner stirred something within him. He knew that turning a blind eye was not an option. By the time Kendrick returned to his office at the U.S. Attorney's office, his resolve had solidified. He didn't waste any time. Instead of filing away the morning's events as an unfortunate incident, Kendrick began documenting everything in meticulous detail. He typed up a comprehensive report, noting not only his own experience, but also the disparate treatment he had observed toward other latecomers in the courtroom. He included timestamps, descriptions of the individuals involved, and even noted the expressions and reactions of those present. Kendrick wasn't just gathering information. He was building a case, one that would hold weight beyond his own experience. As Kendrick reviewed his notes, a pattern began to emerge. Judge Charles Whitman's actions were not a one-time occurrence. The data Kendrick had gathered pointed to a systemic issue, a pattern of disproportionately harsh treatment toward black defendants and attorneys, while white counterparts were often met with leniency or indifference. This isn't just implicit bias, Kendrick thought, his legal instincts sharpening. This is structural. He had seen the consequences of unchecked bias before: lives ruined, families torn apart, and trust in the justice system eroded. And now he was determined to do something about it. Kendrick knew he couldn't take this on alone. He reached out to his colleagues and mentors, sharing his observations and seeking their insights. The responses he received were both affirming and alarming. Several attorneys who had appeared before Judge Whitman recounted similar experiences, moments where they had witnessed subtle but undeniable disparities in how cases were handled. A young black attorney recalled being reprimanded for a minor procedural error, while a white counterpart had been given a pass for a far more significant oversight. Another described how black defendants were often subjected to harsher fines and stricter sentences for the same offenses that white defendants received lighter penalties for. "It's been happening for years," one colleague admitted, "but no one's ever pushed back hard enough." With each conversation, Kendrick's resolve deepened. He wasn't just documenting a single instance of bias. He was uncovering a systemic flaw that demanded accountability. Armed with first-hand experiences and corroborating testimonies, Kendrick prepared to escalate the matter. He compiled his findings into a formal report and submitted it to Julia Harper, his supervisor at the U.S. Attorney's Office. Julia, a no-nonsense attorney with decades of experience, was known for her commitment to justice. When Kendrick handed her the file, her expression hardened as she flipped through the pages. "If what you're describing is accurate," she said, her tone serious, "this isn't just a one-off situation. This could indicate systemic bias." "I believe it does," Kendrick replied firmly. "And I'm certain I'm not the only one who's experienced it." Julia's response was swift and decisive. She contacted the Judicial Review Commission, initiating a formal inquiry into Judge Whitman's conduct. But Kendrick knew this was just the beginning. He spent hours combing through public records, analyzing past cases handled by Judge Whitman. The patterns were undeniable. Over the past 5 years, Black defendants had been fined an average of 300% more than their white counterparts for the same infractions. Late arrivals by white defendants often went unmentioned, while Black defendants faced reprimands and steep fines. Even requests for leniency, such as payment plans, were disproportionately denied to minority defendants. Kendrick's investigation didn't stop there. He reached out to community members, local attorneys, and even courthouse staff who had witnessed the disparities firsthand. Their stories painted a damning picture, a pattern of unequal treatment that had been allowed to fester for far too long. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk who had quietly observed these injustices for years, provided Kendrick with a small notebook she had kept hidden in her desk. "These are notes I've been taking," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every time something didn't sit right, I wrote it down. I was too afraid to say anything. Until now." Her notes were a treasure trove of evidence. Dates, names, and instances of unequal treatment meticulously recorded. Kendrick's findings, combined with Mrs. Thompson's records and the testimonies of others, painted an undeniable picture of bias and discrimination in Judge Whitman's courtroom. As the investigation gained momentum, the story began to leak into the local community. A young law student who had witnessed Kendrick's encounter with Judge Whitman posted a detailed account on social media. Within hours, the post gained traction, sparking outrage and prompting others to come forward with their own stories of courtroom discrimination. Kendrick knew that this was no longer just about his experience. It was about challenging an entire system that had allowed these disparities to go unchecked. As the momentum grew, so did Kendrick's determination. He was no longer just fighting a property tax adjustment or addressing a single act of bias. He was taking on a system that had quietly marginalized and penalized people of color for far too long, and Kendrick Robinson was prepared to see it through to the end. Kendrick Robinson's decision to document his experience in Judge Charles Whitman's courtroom was not just a personal response to the injustice he had faced. It was the first step toward uncovering a deeper, systemic issue. What had started as a seemingly routine morning to challenge a property tax adjustment had turned into a catalyst for something much larger. As Kendrick compiled his observations, reviewed his notes, and spoke with colleagues and community members, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The fine he had received for a minor tardiness was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of disparate treatment, where Black defendants and attorneys faced harsher consequences than their white counterparts. Kendrick's instincts told him that this wasn't a one-time occurrence. It was a symptom of a structural flaw that had been quietly eroding the principles of justice for years. Determined to gather more evidence, Kendrick spent countless hours combing through public records and court documents. He meticulously analyzed cases handled by Judge Whitman over the past 5 years, and the patterns he uncovered were staggering. Black defendants were fined an average of 300% more than white defendants for the same infractions. Requests for leniency, such as payment plans or reduced penalties, were routinely denied to Black defendants while being granted more frequently to white defendants. Late arrivals from white defendants were often overlooked, while Black defendants faced immediate reprimands and steep fines. These disparities weren't just statistical anomalies. They were evidence of systemic bias that had gone unchecked for far too long. Kendrick's investigation extended beyond data analysis. He reached out to community members who had appeared in Judge Whitman's courtroom, asking them to share their experiences. The responses he received painted an even clearer picture of injustice. A young Black woman recounted being fined heavily for a minor parking violation, while a white man with multiple offenses had received only a warning. Another individual described how the judge had cut him off mid-sentence while presenting his case, only to allow a white defendant to fully explain their situation moments later. These stories, shared in quiet confidence, were not just isolated anecdotes. They were part of a larger narrative of systemic inequity that had been allowed to persist unchecked. As Kendrick gathered testimonies, he discovered that even within the courthouse, the disparities had not gone unnoticed. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk who had been quietly observing Judge Whitman's courtroom for years, came forward with a small, worn notebook filled with detailed observations. "These are notes I've been keeping," she said softly, her voice tinged with a mixture of fear and relief. "Every time I saw something that didn't sit right, I wrote it down. I didn't think anyone would ever care." Her notebook was a treasure trove of evidence. Dates, names, and descriptions of instances where defendants had been treated unequally. Mrs. Thompson's notes, combined with Kendrick's data and the first-hand testimonies he had gathered, painted an undeniable picture of bias. But Kendrick's investigation didn't stop there. He spoke with James Wilson, the longtime bailiff in Judge Whitman's courtroom, who had witnessed the same patterns of disparate treatment. "I've been here for 15 years, Wilson admitted, his voice steady but filled with quiet conviction. "I've seen how the judge treats people differently depending on who they are. I always knew it wasn't right, but I didn't think there was anything I could do." Kendrick's conversations with Wilson and others in the courthouse reinforced what he had already suspected. This was not an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a systemic issue that had been allowed to persist due to silence and fear. As Kendrick compiled this mounting evidence, the story began to spread beyond the confines of the courthouse. A young law student who had been present on the morning of Kendrick's encounter with Judge Whitman had posted a detailed account of the incident on social media. Her post, written with raw honesty and conviction, quickly gained traction. Within hours, it had been shared hundreds of times, and comments flooded in from people who had witnessed or experienced similar injustices. "I've seen this happen in courtrooms before," one comment read. "It's about time someone did something about it." Another wrote, "Thank you for standing up. People need to know this is happening." As public interest grew, local news outlets picked up the story. Headlines such as "Bias in Greenville Courtroom," "Federal Prosecutor Challenges Judge's Conduct" dominated the news cycle, sparking widespread outrage. Community leaders and activists began organizing rallies outside the Greenville courthouse, demanding accountability and calling for systemic reform. Signs reading, "Justice should be blind" and "End bias now" filled the streets as protesters gathered to make their voices heard. What had started as a personal encounter had now become a public reckoning. The growing pressure prompted the Judicial Review Commission to launch a formal inquiry into Judge Whitman's conduct. Investigators descended on the courthouse, requesting years of case records and interviewing court staff and attorneys who had appeared before Judge Whitman. Mrs. Thompson's notebook became a pivotal piece of evidence in the investigation, corroborating the patterns Kendrick had uncovered. The testimonies from James Wilson and others provided further validation of the disparities that had been quietly occurring in Judge Whitman's courtroom for years. As the investigation deepened, Judge Whitman's authority began to wane. Rumors circulated that he had been summoned to multiple closed-door meetings with judicial oversight committees. Though he publicly denied any wrongdoing, privately, he began to realize the gravity of the situation. The mounting evidence, combined with growing public scrutiny, left him with little room to maneuver. For the first time in his career, Judge Whitman found himself on the defensive, his reputation hanging by a thread. Meanwhile, Kendrick remained focused on the investigation, refusing to be distracted by the media attention surrounding the case. He worked closely with the Judicial Review Commission, ensuring that every detail was meticulously documented. "This isn't about me," Kendrick reminded himself. "This is about making sure that no one else has to go through this." His unwavering commitment to justice inspired others to come forward, sharing their own stories of discrimination and bias within the legal system. What had once been a quiet, unspoken issue was now a national conversation, forcing courts and judicial institutions to confront the systemic flaws that had long been ignored. As the inquiry moved forward, Kendrick knew that this was more than just a battle for accountability. It was a fight for lasting change. He understood that systemic reform would not happen overnight, but he was prepared to see it through, no matter how long it took. The evidence was undeniable. The voices of those affected were finally being heard, and the momentum for change was building. Kendrick Robinson had ignited a movement that was no longer confined to a single courtroom in Greenville. This was a fight for justice that resonated far beyond the walls of that courthouse, and Kendrick was determined to ensure that the system would never again turn a blind eye to inequity. As Kendrick Robinson's investigation gained momentum, the ripple effects spread far beyond the Greenville courthouse, transforming what had started as a personal fight for justice into a national movement. The evidence Kendrick had meticulously gathered, from statistical data highlighting racial disparities to Mrs. Thompson's handwritten records documenting years of biased decisions, painted an undeniable picture of systemic discrimination in Judge Charles Whitman's courtroom. The $750 fine Kendrick had received for a minor delay was no longer just a moment of personal injustice. It was a reflection of a larger, deeply ingrained issue that had been allowed to persist for far too long. The turning point came when a local news outlet published a detailed exposé titled, "Bias in Greenville Courtroom. Federal Prosecutor Challenges Judge's Conduct." The article not only highlighted Kendrick's encounter with Judge Whitman, but also revealed the broader patterns of racial bias embedded in his courtroom practices. The report cited Kendrick's findings, which showed that black defendants were fined significantly more than their white counterparts for the same infractions, and were less likely to receive leniency. It also included excerpts from Mrs. Thompson's notebook and statements from James Wilson, the longtime bailiff who had quietly observed these injustices unfold over the years. The story quickly spread, gaining national traction. Within days, major media outlets picked up the narrative, and social media erupted with outrage. Hashtags like #EqualJusticeNow and #bias in the courts began trending, as thousands of people shared their own stories of discrimination and injustice in courtrooms across the country. What had begun as a quiet pursuit of justice had ignited a firestorm of awareness and activism. Community activists and civil rights organizations mobilized, organizing rallies outside the Greenville courthouse. Protesters filled the streets, holding signs that read, "Justice should be blind," and "End bias now." The chants of the crowd echoed through the city, demanding accountability and systemic reform. Under mounting public pressure, the Judicial Review Commission, JRC, launched a formal investigation into Judge Whitman's conduct. Investigators combed through years of court records, interviewed staff members, and scrutinized sentencing patterns to identify discrepancies. Mrs. Thompson's notebook became a pivotal piece of evidence, validating Kendrick's findings with detailed notes of unequal treatment that had been quietly documented over the years. James Wilson, the bailiff who had witnessed the same patterns, spoke candidly with investigators, adding weight to the growing case against Judge Whitman. "I've seen this happen too many times," Wilson told the commission. "It's time for something to change." As the investigation unfolded, more stories of injustice began to surface. Former defendants who had appeared before Judge Whitman came forward to share their experiences. A black mother recounted being fined $500 for contesting a minor zoning violation despite providing clear evidence that the city was at fault. A young man described how the judge had belittled him in court, questioning his work ethic, only to dismiss a similar case involving a white defendant moments later. These testimonies painted a chilling portrait of bias and inequity that had persisted unchecked for years. The national conversation about racial disparities in the justice system intensified. Prominent civil rights leaders, legal experts, and community advocates joined the call for change. "This isn't just about one judge in Greenville," one activist declared during a televised interview. "This is about a system that has failed communities of color for too long. It's time to fix it." Social media continued to amplify the voices of those who had long been ignored, while legal scholars and journalists debated the implications of Kendrick's findings. The movement was no longer confined to Greenville. It was spreading across the country, forcing judicial institutions to confront the systemic flaws that had been overlooked for generations. Meanwhile, Judge Whitman's once unquestioned authority began to crumble under the weight of mounting evidence. His initial attempts to dismiss the allegations as misunderstandings were met with skepticism and public outrage. Behind closed doors, Whitman faced intense scrutiny from judicial oversight committees. Rumors circulated that he had been summoned to multiple closed-door meetings with senior members of the Judicial Review Commission, where he was confronted with the damning evidence that had been brought to light. Despite his public denials, privately, Judge Whitman knew that his career was on the verge of collapse. As the investigation reached its peak, Judge Whitman made a surprising announcement. He was resigning from the bench. In a brief public statement, he expressed regret for any unintentional harm, and claimed that his decision to step down was in the best interest of the court and the community. But his words rang hollow in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. For the community, his resignation was not a moment of celebration, but a necessary first step toward holding the system accountable. For Kendrick, however, Judge Whitman's resignation was far from the end of the fight. "This isn't about one judge," he reminded himself. "This is about making sure it doesn't happen again." Kendrick remained laser-focused on pushing for systemic reform, He worked closely with the Judicial Review Commission to implement lasting changes, including mandatory bias training for judges, regular audits of case outcomes, and the establishment of independent oversight committees. These reforms, Kendrick believed, were critical to ensuring that what had happened in Judge Whitman's courtroom would never happen again. The ripple effects of Kendrick's actions extended beyond Greenville. Inspired by his efforts, communities across the country began examining their own court systems. State judicial boards initiated reviews of municipal courts, and judicial oversight committees vowed to root out systemic discrimination. Kendrick's story had become a catalyst for change, igniting a movement that transcended city limits and state borders. As Kendrick stood once again on the steps of the Greenville courthouse, he felt a quiet sense of resolve. The journey had been long and arduous, but the voices that had been silenced for so long were finally being heard. The momentum for change was undeniable, and Kendrick was determined to ensure that the fight for justice would continue. "We've started something," he thought, "and now it's up to all of us to see it through." For Kendrick Robinson, this was never just about one morning or one judge. It was about transforming a system, and he was ready to keep fighting until justice truly became blind. Months after Judge Charles Whitman's resignation, the landscape of the Greenville Municipal Courthouse had undergone a remarkable transformation, both physically and systemically. What had once been a place where bias lurked beneath the surface of judicial proceedings was now a courthouse committed to fairness, transparency, and accountability. The walls, once a dull beige that seemed to absorb the weight of injustice, had been repainted in a brighter hue. A new welcome desk greeted visitors at the entrance, staffed with individuals trained to guide defendants through the complexities of the legal system. Signs in multiple languages directed people to resources they had previously not known were available, from payment plans to legal aid and procedural guides. But beyond these visible changes, the most significant transformation had taken place within the courtroom itself. Kendrick Robinson stood quietly at the back of the newly renovated courtroom, his eyes scanning the room where everything had begun. He had been invited to speak to a group of local judges and attorneys about the changes that had been implemented, changes that his relentless pursuit of justice had set in motion. As he waited for his turn, Kendrick felt a mixture of pride and cautious optimism. The reforms that had taken root in Greenville were not just symbolic gestures. They were substantive measures designed to address the deep-seated inequities that had plagued the system for years. Judges and court personnel were now required to undergo mandatory bias training led by experts who tackled the subtle, often unconscious ways discrimination could seep into decision-making. Regular audits of court decisions had been instituted to ensure that patterns of bias were identified and corrected. And perhaps most importantly, independent oversight committees composed of legal experts, community advocates, and former defendants had been established to monitor court proceedings and hold the system accountable. As Kendrick observed the changes unfolding before him, he couldn't help but reflect on how far things had come. It had been just a few months since he had stood in this very room, fined $750 for arriving mere minutes late, an excessive punishment that had exposed the glaring disparities in how defendants were treated. That morning had set off a chain of events that led to Judge Whitman's resignation and the implementation of sweeping reforms. But for Kendrick, the most rewarding part was not the reforms themselves. It was the impact those changes had on the people who came through the courthouse doors. In the weeks following the reforms, defendants who had once felt powerless began to experience a different kind of courtroom, one where their voices were heard and their cases were treated with dignity. Payment plans, which had previously been denied disproportionately to black defendants, were now being approved more often. Defendants reported feeling that they were treated with more respect, and the anxiety that once gripped the waiting area had begun to dissipate. This is what justice is supposed to feel like, Kendrick thought as he watched a young man approach the bench to contest a minor violation. The judge listened intently, gave the young man a chance to explain his circumstances, and offered him a fair solution. It was a small moment, but for Kendrick, it symbolized the broader change that was taking root. Kendrick's influence extended beyond the walls of the Greenville courthouse. The impact of his actions had sparked a wave of introspection and reform across the country. Inspired by Kendrick's story, other communities in South Carolina and beyond began reevaluating their own court systems. State judicial review boards implemented mandatory audits of case outcomes, focusing on identifying racial and socioeconomic disparities. Oversight committees were established in several states to monitor judicial conduct and ensure that decisions were made without bias. Legal advocacy groups launched initiatives to educate defendants about their rights and provide them with the resources they needed to navigate the justice system. Even within the federal justice system, Kendrick's actions had left a lasting mark. His work had prompted discussions within the Department of Justice about the need for greater oversight and accountability at all levels of the judiciary. "Kendrick, you've started something bigger than you realize," Julia Harper, his supervisor at the U.S. Attorney's Office, had told him during a recent meeting. "This isn't just about Greenville anymore. This is about changing the culture of our legal system." Kendrick had always believed that true change required more than just exposing injustice. It required creating structures that prevented injustice from taking root in the first place. And now, those structures were beginning to take shape. Back in Greenville, the ripple effects of Kendrick's work were visible not just in the courtroom, but in the lives of the people who had been impacted by the old system. James Wilson, the veteran bailiff who had served under Judge Whitman for years, was now leading bias training sessions for court officers, using his first-hand experiences to educate new hires about the importance of impartiality. "Our job isn't just to keep order," he told a room full of recruits during one session. "It's to ensure that everyone who steps into this room is treated with dignity. If you see something wrong, speak up. Silence is complicity." Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk whose detailed records had been instrumental in exposing the bias in Judge Whitman's courtroom, had been promoted to oversee a new program focused on ethical court practices. She worked tirelessly mentoring younger clerks and ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. "I never thought anyone would listen," she had confided to Kendrick after the reforms had been implemented. "But now that they have, I won't stop fighting to make sure it doesn't happen again." Kendrick's influence extended beyond the legal community. He had been invited to teach a seminar on ethics and civil rights in the judiciary at a nearby law school. His class quickly became one of the most popular courses, attracting students eager to learn about how they could make a difference in the justice system. After one of his lectures, a young black law student approached Kendrick, her eyes filled with determination. "You've shown me that the law isn't just about rules," she said softly. "It's about people. You've given me a reason to fight for justice." Kendrick smiled, humbled by her words. "The fight is just beginning," he replied. "But if we all do our part, we can make the system better." As Kendrick stood at the podium that afternoon, addressing the room full of judges and attorneys, he spoke not about his own accomplishments, but about the power of collective action. "Justice isn't just about laws," he said, his voice resonating with conviction. "It's about how we treat the people who come into our courtrooms. It's about fairness, dignity, and respect. And it's about ensuring that every person, no matter who they are, knows that they matter." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Kendrick's focus was on the faces in the crowd. He saw hope, determination, and the beginnings of real change. And he knew that while the work was far from over, this was a step in the right direction. As Kendrick left the courthouse that day, he glanced at the framed document hanging on his office wall, the $750 fine that had set everything in motion. Below it was a photo from a recent event, a group of young law students who had started a civil rights clinic in his honor. Their smiles radiated hope, and Kendrick couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility toward the next generation of legal minds. The fight for justice doesn't end here, he thought. But we're on the right path. And as he stepped out into the cool afternoon air, Kendrick Robinson knew that his work was far from finished, but he was ready for whatever came next. Several months after the dramatic events that had unfolded in the Greenville Municipal Courthouse, the ripple effects of Kendrick Robinson's actions continued to reshape not only Greenville's judicial system, but also courtrooms across the nation. What had started as a seemingly routine morning, a federal prosecutor seeking to correct a property tax adjustment, had ignited a national conversation about systemic bias and inequality within the justice system. Kendrick's courageous decision to challenge Judge Charles Whitman's biased conduct had not only led to the judge's resignation, but had also laid the groundwork for meaningful long-term reforms. But for Kendrick, this was never about one judge or one courthouse. It was about transforming a broken system and ensuring that the principles of fairness, dignity, and respect were upheld for all. As Kendrick walked through the renovated halls of the Greenville Courthouse, he couldn't help but notice how much had changed. The walls, once dull and lifeless, had been repainted, and a new judicial ethics center had been established to promote fairness and transparency in the legal system. A small but significant plaque near the entrance read, Equal justice is everyone's right. Inside, the atmosphere was noticeably different. Defendants who had once felt powerless now had access to resources they hadn't known existed before. Payment plans, legal aid, and clear procedural guides were now readily available. The waiting area, which had once been filled with anxiety and uncertainty, was now a place where people felt they had a fair chance to be heard. The most profound changes, however, were taking place inside the courtroom. A younger, more progressive judge had replaced Whitman, someone with a reputation for fairness and impartiality. But it wasn't just about who sat on the bench. Systemic reforms were now in place to ensure that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. Judges and court staff were required to attend mandatory bias training to recognize and address unconscious prejudices that could affect their decisions. Regular audits of case outcomes were conducted to identify patterns of discrimination, and independent oversight committees composed of community advocates, legal experts, and former defendants had been established to monitor courtroom practices and hold the system accountable. Kendrick had been invited to the courthouse that day to speak at the unveiling of the new Judicial Ethics Center, a project that had been inspired by his work. As he stood at the podium, addressing a room filled with judges, attorneys, community leaders, and young law students, Kendrick's mind drifted back to the moment that had set everything in motion. He had stood in this very courtroom, fined $750 for a minor delay, while others who had arrived late were met with indifference. That moment had ignited a fire in him, a determination not just to correct a personal injustice, but to challenge a system that had quietly perpetuated inequity for years. Justice isn't just about following the letter of the law, Kendrick began, his voice steady but filled with conviction. It's about ensuring that every person who walks into a courtroom is treated with dignity and respect. It's about recognizing that fairness isn't automatic. It's something we have to fight for every single day. The applause that followed was heartfelt and sincere, but for Kendrick, the real reward was seeing the impact that these changes had on the lives of ordinary people. This is what real progress looks like, he thought as he watched a diverse group of law students eagerly taking notes, their eyes filled with hope and determination. Many of them had been inspired by Kendrick's story, and some had even gone on to establish civil rights clinics dedicated to advocating for marginalized communities. If we can inspire the next generation to carry this work forward, Kendrick reflected, then the fight for justice will continue long after I'm gone. Beyond Greenville, Kendrick's influence had reached far and wide. His work had inspired communities across the country to take a hard look at their own court systems. State judicial review boards in multiple states had initiated mandatory audits of municipal courts, focusing on identifying and addressing racial and socioeconomic disparities. Oversight committees were being formed in cities and towns where similar patterns of bias had been identified, ensuring that no judge operated without accountability. Even at the federal level, Kendrick's actions had sparked discussions about the need for greater oversight and transparency in the judiciary. Kendrick, you've started something bigger than you realize. Julia Harper, his supervisor at the U.S. Attorney's Office, had told him during a recent meeting. This isn't just about one courthouse in Greenville. This is about changing how we think about justice everywhere. Kendrick's commitment to justice extended beyond the courtroom. He had taken on a new role as a guest lecturer at a local law school, where he taught a course on ethics and civil rights in the judiciary. His classes quickly became some of the most popular on campus, drawing in students who were eager to learn how they could make a difference. After one of his lectures, a young black law student approached Kendrick, her eyes filled with determination. "You've shown me that the law isn't just about rules and procedures," she said softly. "It's about people. You've given me a reason to fight for justice." Kendrick smiled, humbled by her words. "The fight is just beginning," he replied gently. "But if we all do our part, we can make the system better." The impact of Kendrick's work was also felt within the local community. James Wilson, the veteran bailiff who had served under Judge Whitman, had become a leading voice for change within the courthouse. He now led bias training sessions for court officers, emphasizing the importance of treating everyone with dignity and fairness. "Our job isn't just to keep order," he told a group of new recruits during one session. "It's to ensure that everyone who steps into this room feels that they matter. And if you see something wrong, speak up. Silence is complicity." Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk whose meticulous notes had been instrumental in exposing the bias in Judge Whitman's courtroom, had been promoted to oversee a new program focused on ethical court practices. She worked tirelessly to mentor younger clerks, ensuring that they understood the importance of fairness and transparency in their work. "I never thought anyone would listen," she had confided to Kendrick after the reforms had been implemented. "But now that they have, I won't stop fighting to make sure it never happens again." As Kendrick walked through the halls of the courthouse that afternoon, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The framed document of the $750 fine that had started it all still hung on his office wall, not as a reminder of injustice, but as a symbol of what could be achieved when one person refused to stay silent. Below it was a photo from a recent event, a group of young law students who had founded a civil rights clinic in his honor. Their smiles radiated hope, and Kendrick couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility toward the next generation of legal minds. The fight for justice doesn't end here, Kendrick thought as he stepped outside into the cool afternoon air. But we're on the right path. His work was far from finished, but Kendrick Robinson was ready for whatever came next. He knew that the changes he had fought for were not just for himself, but for all those who had been silenced or ignored for too long. And as he looked toward the future, Kendrick felt certain that the seeds of change he had planted would continue to grow, ensuring that justice, true, unbiased justice, would become a reality for all. Three months after the pivotal morning that had set everything in motion, the Greenville Municipal Courthouse stood as a symbol of transformation and progress. What had once been a place where injustice quietly thrived had now become a beacon of hope and accountability. The physical changes were immediately noticeable. The walls that had once been a dull, lifeless beige had been repainted, and the tired wooden benches that had borne witness to years of inequity had been replaced. A new welcome desk greeted visitors at the entrance, staffed by individuals trained not only in court procedures, but also in providing guidance to those who needed it most. Signs in multiple languages directed defendants and their families to resources they had previously been unaware of. Payment plans, legal aid, and procedural guides that ensured everyone had access to the support they needed. But the real change went beyond aesthetics. Inside the courtroom, the culture had shifted dramatically. The rigid, unyielding atmosphere that once permeated Judge Charles Whitman's courtroom had been replaced by one of fairness, compassion, and transparency. A younger judge with a reputation for integrity and impartiality had taken over, bringing with them a new era of justice. Kendrick Robinson, whose determination had sparked this transformation, stood quietly at the back of the room, observing the unfolding changes. He had been invited to speak at the unveiling of the new Judicial Ethics Center, a center designed to ensure that the principles of fairness and accountability were ingrained in the fabric of the judicial system. As Kendrick watched the proceedings, his mind drifted back to the moment that had started it all. That morning, he had come to court expecting nothing more than to contest a property tax adjustment, but instead, he had witnessed a glaring act of injustice. His fine of $750 for arriving just minutes late, while other latecomers were ignored, had been the catalyst for something much bigger. Kendrick had recognized the disparity immediately, but instead of walking away, he had chosen to confront it head-on. It wasn't just about me, Kendrick reflected as he looked around the transformed courtroom. It was about making sure that no one else had to experience what I did. The reforms Kendrick had fought for were now firmly in place. Mandatory bias training was now required for all judges and court personnel, focusing on recognizing and addressing implicit biases that could influence decisions. Regular audits of court outcomes were conducted to ensure that disparities were identified and corrected before they became systemic issues. Independent oversight committees composed of legal experts, community advocates, and former defendants had been established to monitor court proceedings and ensure that fairness was not just an aspiration, but a reality. These changes were not merely symbolic. They were tangible safeguards designed to prevent the injustices of the past from repeating themselves. Kendrick had also worked closely with the Judicial Review Commission to ensure that these reforms extended beyond Greenville. His efforts had inspired similar changes in other communities across the country. State judicial review boards in multiple states had implemented mandatory audits of municipal courts, with a focus on identifying patterns of racial and socioeconomic disparities. Oversight committees were established in cities where similar issues had been identified, ensuring that judges and court personnel operated with accountability and transparency. Kendrick's work had sparked a national conversation about the need for systemic reform, and the impact of his efforts was being felt far beyond the walls of the Greenville courthouse. But Kendrick's influence extended beyond policy changes and procedural reforms. His actions had inspired a new generation of legal minds to see the law not just as a set of rules, but as a tool for ensuring justice and equity. He had been invited to teach a seminar on ethics and civil rights in the judiciary at a nearby law school, where his classes quickly became some of the most popular on campus. Students, many of whom had been inspired by Kendrick's story, filled the lecture hall eager to learn how they could make a difference. After one of his lectures, a young black law student approached Kendrick, her voice filled with quiet determination. "You've shown me that the law isn't just about enforcing rules," she said softly. "It's about making sure those rules are applied fairly. You've given me a reason to fight for justice." Kendrick smiled, deeply moved by her words. "The fight is just beginning," he replied gently. "But if we all do our part, we can make the system better." Beyond the classroom, Kendrick's impact was also felt in the community. James Wilson, the longtime bailiff who had witnessed firsthand the disparities in Judge Whitman's courtroom, had become a powerful advocate for change. Now, he led bias training sessions for court officers, drawing from his own experiences to emphasize the importance of treating every individual with dignity and fairness. "Our job isn't just to keep order," he told a group of new recruits during one session. "It's to make sure that everyone who steps into this room feels like they matter. If you see something wrong, speak up. Silence is complicity." Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk whose detailed records had been instrumental in exposing the biases in Judge Whitman's courtroom, had been promoted to oversee a new program focused on ethical court practices. She worked tirelessly to mentor younger clerks, instilling in them the importance of fairness and integrity in their work. "I never thought anyone would listen," she had confided to Kendrick after the reforms had been implemented. "But now that they have, I won't stop fighting to make sure this never happens again." As Kendrick stood at the podium that afternoon, addressing a room full of judges, attorneys, community leaders, and law students, he spoke not about his own achievements, but about the power of collective action. "Justice isn't just about the decisions we make in the courtroom," Kendrick said, his voice filled with conviction. "It's about how we treat the people who come before us. It's about ensuring that every person, no matter who they are or where they come from, is treated with dignity and respect. And it's about recognizing that true change doesn't happen overnight. It's something we have to commit to, day after day." The applause that followed was heartfelt and genuine, but for Kendrick, the true reward was knowing that the seeds of change he had planted were beginning to bear fruit. As he left the courtroom that day, Kendrick glanced once again at the framed document that hung on the wall of his office, the $750 fine that had started it all. But below it was something even more meaningful. A photo of a group of young law students who had founded a civil rights clinic in his honor, dedicated to fighting for justice and advocating for marginalized communities. Their smiles radiated hope, and Kendrick felt a deep sense of responsibility to ensure that their optimism was not misplaced. "The fight for justice doesn't end here," Kendrick thought as he stepped outside into the cool afternoon air. "But we're on the right path." His work was far from finished, but Kendrick Robinson knew that the changes he had fought for were no longer just a dream. They were becoming a reality. And as he looked toward the future, he felt certain that the legacy he had built would continue to inspire others to stand up, speak out, and ensure that justice was truly blind for all. The story of Kendrick Robinson's courageous fight against systemic bias is more than just a tale of courtroom injustice. It is a powerful reminder that one person's actions can ignite lasting change. For older adults, many of whom have witnessed decades of societal transformation, Kendrick's journey serves as a testament to the fact that change is possible at any stage of life. His persistence in challenging unfair treatment and exposing the systemic flaws within the justice system highlights several profound lessons that resonate deeply, especially with those who have lived through times of social upheaval and progress. One of the most compelling lessons from Kendrick's journey is the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Faced with blatant injustice in the courtroom, Kendrick could have chosen to pay his fine, walk away, and move on with his life. But instead, he chose to confront the inequities he witnessed, knowing that silence would allow injustice to persist. "Silence is complicity," as James Wilson, the bailiff, later echoed. This lesson is especially relevant to older generations who have seen firsthand the importance of speaking up for civil rights, equality, and fairness. It is a reminder that we all have a responsibility to stand against injustice, regardless of our age or stage in life. Kendrick's journey also illustrates that small actions can lead to big changes. His decision to question an excessive fine, an act that seemed minor at the time, set off a chain of events that led to sweeping reforms, not only in Greenville but in courtrooms across the country. This underscores a powerful truth. Small actions, when guided by principle and persistence, can create ripple effects that lead to monumental change. For older adults who may sometimes feel that their contributions or voices are less impactful, Kendrick's story is a poignant reminder that every action, no matter how small, can make a difference. Another valuable lesson from Kendrick's experience is the importance of lifelong learning and adaptation. Throughout his journey, Kendrick demonstrated an unwavering commitment to learning, not just about the law, but also about the deeper societal issues that perpetuate inequality. He took the time to gather evidence, listen to the experiences of others, and collaborate with colleagues and community members. His willingness to continuously learn and adapt was critical to his success. This resonates strongly with older generations who understand that growth and learning never stop, no matter one's age. Just as Kendrick's openness to knowledge enabled him to drive change, older adults can embrace the idea that it's never too late to learn, grow, and make a meaningful impact. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from Kendrick's journey is the importance of leaving a positive legacy. His work didn't just result in policy changes. It inspired a new generation of law students, community leaders, and advocates who are now carrying his mission forward. Kendrick's story highlights that true legacy is not measured by personal achievements but by the positive impact we leave on others. For older adults, this is a powerful call to action. Whether through mentoring, volunteering, or advocating for causes that matter, there are countless ways to contribute to a better future for the next generation. Finally, Kendrick's unwavering determination in the face of obstacles is a reminder that persistence is key to overcoming challenges. His journey was not easy. He faced skepticism, resistance, and immense pressure, but he never gave up. This lesson is particularly relevant to older adults who have faced and overcome their own challenges throughout life. Persistence, patience, and resilience are timeless virtues that can continue to drive positive change, even in the face of adversity. For older generations who have witnessed the evolution of civil rights, social movements, and societal progress, Kendrick's story is a call to continue that legacy. Advocating for fairness, supporting community initiatives, and mentoring younger generations are all ways that older adults can apply these lessons in their own lives. "The fight for justice doesn't end here," Kendrick once said. And that message resonates deeply with those who know that the pursuit of justice and equity is an ongoing journey. Kendrick's story reminds us that every individual has the power to shape the world around them, and it's never too late to make a difference.